Nuclear disasters are a terrible phenomenon. They cause the death of a large number of people, not only at the time of the explosion, but also much later. Infected people are highly likely to develop the most dangerous diseases. Nearby and even distant territories, which are several hundred kilometers away from the epicenter of the explosion, become contaminated. Arable land, meadows, rivers, and forests become unsuitable for economic activity. The contaminated area simply becomes a deserted territory, which is absolutely unsuitable for economic activity and dangerous for human habitation. The most famous nuclear disaster is the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But even before this serious tragedy, there was another nuclear disaster, which was the first of its kind. It was called the Kyshtym tragedy. For a long time it was under secret. Not only the details were not told to the population, but even the accident itself was not announced to anyone. And even today it still remains a secret. The Kyshtym tragedy took place on 29th September 1957. The event happened at the top-secret plant number 8 Offentin. It is located in the Chelyabinsk region. The plant was located in the secret territory of Chelyabinsk 40. This tragedy has nothing to do with Kyshtym. Simply this settlement was close to the place where the plant was located. Today this area is called Ozersk. A closed city is located there. In the times of the USSR, this point was not indicated on maps. Therefore, the nearby settlement was taken to indicate the catastrophe. Chemical Combine number 8 Mantin, under the name Mayak, was the first enterprise in the Soviet Union, which produced the atomic explosive substance plutonium-239. All radioactive waste was stored in special stainless steel containers, called cans. These cans were placed in reinforced concrete canyons deep underground. A cooling system circulated in the concrete tanks. Because the nuclear reaction was not yet complete after the waste was dumped, the mass placed had to be cooled. Eventually, one of the cans exploded and 200 tons of poison spewed out. The cooling system and water circulation were regulated by special sensors. Half an hour before the explosion, the duty team went down to the tank. The crew members saw a strange yellow smoke coming from under the ground, and inside there was a strong heat. Specialists decided that there was a short circuit, but could not find its source. Later it turned out that the cooling system had broken down, and in the container set the temperature of plus 330 degrees. The failure of the cooling system is called one of the causes of the disaster. For another reason, the tragedy occurred because of the rush during construction. The Soviet Union urgently needed to create nuclear weapons, as the Americans had already demonstrated them in Hiroshima. Atomgrads began to be built near Chelyabinsk. The place was chosen because the region is far from the border. It was necessary to erect the classified plant in the shortest possible time. Even by the standards of the USSR, it was built very quickly. At the same time, designs were drawn and walls were erected. There was not enough protective clothing for the workers, and the dosimeters did not have the necessary level. At times, workers used their bare hands to wipe up reagents that poured out of old pipes. Equipment for Mayak was taken from chemical industry plants. Specialized equipment had not been created yet. Radiation often disrupted the instruments. According to one version, on the day of the tragedy, the devices also failed. The explosion occurred at 1622. The concrete cylinder cover, which weighed 160 tons, was torn off. The explosion damaged the lids of other tanks as well. Windows, doors and gates were blown out at facilities that were within a 200-meter radius. A cloud of radioactive dust rose into the air. People did not know what had happened. Even the workers of the facility did not immediately realize that a tragedy had occurred. And Chelyabinsk journalists dubbed this phenomenon the Northern Lights. People were urgently evacuated from Mayak. To eliminate the consequences of the accident, soldiers who were serving in barracks nearby were also involved. However, they were in no hurry to join the battle. They realized that the consequences of the accident could have a very destructive effect on their bodies. The cloud of radioactive dust traveled 350 kilometers. However, Chelyabinsk was not affected because of the wind rose, which blew in a different direction. If the wind had blown in the direction of the city, many of its residents could have felt the consequences of the nuclear disaster. A week passed while studies were conducted on the level of environmental pollution at the plant itself and in the neighboring areas. At that time, residents from the neighboring villages were evacuated. The radiation level was measured, and everything that exceeded the permissible norms was destroyed and destroyed. People had a choice of being offered money to compensate for the destruction of their livestock and homes, or they could move to areas that were specifically designated for resettlement. However, the locals did not understand why they had to leave their homes. After all, no one had explained to them what had really happened. Some people thought that their villages would be excavated for minerals or some dangerous substances. People defended their property not only by force, but sometimes used weapons, and the employees who were entrusted with announcing the resettlement to local residents were forbidden to divulge the secret about the Kyshtym tragedy. We had to get out of it somehow and tell people that it had become dangerous to live on this territory. And why it had become dangerous remained a mystery. The residents were explained that they should not go out into the street unnecessarily. But they continued to feed their cattle, harvest crops, and fish in the river. As a result, those who were outdoors a lot received serious doses of radiation. It was only when animals began to die that the inhabitants of the local villages realized that something serious had happened, and they began to gradually move out of their territories. At the same time, they signed a non-disclosure agreement for 25 years, although they already knew nothing. Fortunately, there were no casualties at Mayak, except for those people who received serious doses of radiation. But their problems began to appear several years, or even several decades later. Therefore, we cannot say that anyone was injured at the time of the explosion. Although the Western press at the time wrote that there were hundreds of victims on the territory of the Combine, but it was all a dissident provocation. The chief engineer of the Combine was fired, and the director also lost his position, but was transferred to another forbidden site. On the site of the atomic trace, they created the East Ural Reserve. There is still an exclusion zone there, surrounded by barbed wire. This is a unique object, where scientists study the effect of radiation on animal and plant life. As a result of the study, it was found out that coniferous plants tolerate radioactive substances very badly. Birch trees, on the other hand, are more resistant to them. Currently, part of the reserve is open. In addition to the large number of victims, the Western press also talked about the fact that people are being experimented on in the area of the explosion. They are not told about the catastrophe on purpose, and they are not evacuated anywhere. They are closely monitoring how radiation affects their bodies, and they keep a record of the casualties. In reality, of course, there was no such thing. All the workers were evacuated from the plant as soon as possible, and they passed through several purification zones. Having become the first nuclear disaster, the Kyshtym tragedy served as a basis for correct actions after the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. All the mistakes made in evacuating people and eliminating the consequences of the accident were taken into account at Chernobyl. If the tragedy in Ozersk had not been taken into account, the consequences at Chernobyl would have been more devastating. Research on the causes and events of the Kyshtym tragedy is still underway. Some documents are still not declassified, but people already have the opportunity to learn about the events of those distant years. It is important to tell about it to prevent new catastrophes, although perhaps people do not need to know everything.